struggle, materialism, the indigenous struggle, and ecological crisis.
All right, thank you. So I just want to quickly apologize for the PowerPoint. Philosophers in general are not renowned for their PowerPoint skills, at least continental philosophers. But I got this email, about having one, and I felt like I should do it. So this is sort of like a weird fever dream that I put together last night. Okay. So in the months before President Trump began hurriedly burying each outrage with the next, the Standing Rock Sioux fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline galvanized a remarkable outpouring of popular support and solidarity. In November, prominent climate activist Bill McKibben highlighted the echoes of the civil rights era, noting that Dapple's dogs and Dalrymple's fire hosers were reminiscent of Bull Connor's Alabama. And it seemed that from the Facebook check-ins and celebrity endorsements and so forth, that many Americans felt this resonance as well. However, while grateful for the support and the exposure, many Standing Rock activists also pointed out that genuine solidarity with indigenous struggles for self-determination and environmental protection might ultimately entail something more. Broadly speaking, the question that I want to grapple with a little bit here today is what it would really mean to stand with Standing Rock. And unfortunately, just in the interest of time, I've had to evacuate most of the actual specifics about various struggles. So this is going to be a very broad view of that question. But I'm going to start with the assumption that the audience here already recognizes that capitalism entails imperialism and environmental destruction. So while I'm going to begin by just saying a few words about some aspects of that dynamic, my central concern today is going to be with what kind of arrangement would actually avoid and possibly begin to repair the damage of these interlinked evils. And that's a condition that I consider necessary for genuine solidarity with indigenous movements for environmental protection. In examining this question, I want to just highlight a few persistent indigenous criticisms of Marxism in light of ambiguities in Marx's writing about which features of capitalism are progressive, and I want to consider what an adequate incorporation of these critiques might entail as a Marxist myself. As Marx wrote in the section of Capital dealing with so-called primitive accumulation and colonialism, capital comes dripping from head to foot from every pore with blood and dirt. And contemporary Marxists such as Maria Mies, David Harvey, Jason Moore, and Nancy Fraser have endeavored to point out that such dispossession did not slowly disappear after the birth of capitalism or even with the official end of the colonial era. Rather, to maintain profitability, capitalism continues to require cheap material resources, energy, raw materials, etc., and labor, meaning that it can avoid fully paying the costs of their reproduction. Moore, in particular, has made this central to his account of capitalism as a way of organizing nature, as many of you know. It's also important for our purposes to emphasize that in addition to extraction and production, the transportation and infrastructural logistics of capitalism's material and energetic bases have also necessitated imperialist incursions, obviously across the Middle East, but also in places like South Dakota and British Columbia. And this is bad enough. However, as with climate change, to get the full picture of ecological imperialism of the relevant sort that we're talking about today, we also need to understand the vicious feedback loops involved. So with climate change, you have these sorts of feedback loops that can happen where as the planet warms, some of the ice melts, which means it's reflecting less light back out into space, and this accelerates warming. The tundra thaws, the methane comes out, and this accelerates warming, right? Which lets more methane come out. So I want to argue that there's, in some ways, a similar sort of thing at work when we're talking about ecological imperialism. So, for example, imperial exploits have created widespread misery, poverty, and environmental destruction in the system's periphery in the process of accumulating wealth for the core, right? But meanwhile, this wealth is also characterized by rampant consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, which are now themselves being offshored, leading to millions of deaths due to pollution in the South. This overconsumption premised on the production of poverty through the destruction of subsistence-based forms of life, including whole cosmologies and epistemologies, in many ways better suited to sustainability than those we have inherited, in turn subjects the world's poor and dispossessed, who are the least responsible for climate change and toxification, to its worst effects. And as migration pressures subsequently intensify and climate change fuels scarcity and conflicts in parts of the world already destabilized by imperialism, from Honduras to Syria, xenophobia and militarism have further increased in the core. The Pentagon and other northern military and intelligence agencies are preparing for a global resource counterinsurgency, and as Dr. Parenti notes in Tropic of Chaos, quote, the new maps of the military planners are drawing up are just the old map, the geography of empire. Let me just give one brief example that begins to try to illustrate this dynamic, as well as some of the difficulties that I think we face in escaping it and beginning to make reparations. So Bolivia is the second poorest country in the hemisphere after Haiti, and you can tell a similar story, and sometimes I do tell a similar story about Haiti, but not today. Bolivia is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change, and this last year was in a state. So I forgot to mention this, but this is just so that you can see a little bit of this dynamic visually. This is historical CO2 emissions through 2011, right, with the map adjusted to scale. This is CO2 consumption per capita, and then if you look at people living on $1.25 or less per day, which is highly correlated with climate vulnerability and actual climate-related injuries and displacements, you'll notice that these maps are basically the inverse of each other, right? Okay, so back to Bolivia. So over the last year, Bolivia was in a state of emergency due to severe drought, and this was caused primarily by the recession of glaciers thanks to climate change, but it was also exacerbated by the use of scarce potable water from mining. Now, as many of you probably know, Bolivia has a long history of exploitative foreign mining, and indeed this history fundamentally shaped the modern world, as the bulk of Europe's silver for 2 centuries came from the mines of Potosi and the surrounding area, mined by millions of Inca slaves and indentured servants who were worked to death in the mines. They called Potosi the mountain that eats men. And then I should also mention there were at least 30,000 African slaves that they brought in as well when they ran out of natives. Although the silver is now long gone, the mountain is actually still being mined for other minerals, and the peak has now begun to cave in and has had to be sort of progressively scaffolded to prevent its collapse, which is in some ways, I think, an apt metaphor. So then after the rubber boom in this area, and to get a sense of what this was like, if you haven't seen this movie, Embrace of the Serpent, you have to like run home and go check it out. It's fantastic. As in most of the rest of Latin America in the 20th century, the US backed a series of right-wing military governments in Bolivia through various coups, assassinations, torture campaigns, and so on, as well as imposing harsh structural adjustment policies. Bolivia was sort of one of the testing grounds for structural adjustment policies, basically, before this was a real thing with the IMF. In order to ensure that Bolivia's tin mines, which for some time supplied more than half of the world's tin, oil and natural gas reserves, and even rainwater remained open to foreign exploitation. As many of you also, I'm sure, know, Evo Morales came to power protesting these imperialist incursions, but despite his frequent denunciations of capitalism and imperialism and his outspoken advocacy on climate change and water rights, the Morales administration has also engaged in extensive extractivism to finance its social programs and has used state violence against sectors of his indigenous base who tried to resist environmentally destructive projects. You can tell a similar story also with Korea and Ecuador and in other places. Furthermore, I just want to note that Bolivia's current round of extractivism is not tied only to hydrocarbons. With 50 to 70% of the world's known lithium deposits residing under salt flats not far from Potosi, Bolivia is on the forefront of a new round of renewable energy resource extraction, and I'm going to return to this point in a moment. But first I want to sort of jump around a little bit and look at a couple persistent indigenous criticisms of Marxism, and you'll see hopefully where I'm going with this in a minute. Okay. Marxism allows us to understand the structural relationships between capitalism, imperialism, and ecological destruction, I want to argue, more completely than competing frameworks. However, we have to recognize that the profit motive is not the sole driver of ecological imperialism, which existed before capitalism and might well exist after it. Indigenous criticisms of Marxism endeavor to highlight this fact and thus the need for a more comprehensive alternative vision. This is, obviously very hard to generalize about. There are a lot of wildly divergent cultural groups that self-identify as indigenous with different belief systems and traditions of resistance, which are also themselves internally heterogeneous. So like when I was at Standing Rock, there were like very serious arguments about some of the questions I'm going to be talking about here within different factions, right, of the Standing Rock Sioux. So I want to try and avoid like essentializing or romanticizing, which is something that indigenous scholars can sometimes also be guilty of. But I want to claim that sort of like, very broadly speaking within the literature, one does find a reasonably consistent and persistent set of central concerns about Marxist theory. And some of the most common overlapping criticisms one finds are that Marxism inherits and perpetuates a European view of nature as sort of just inert dead stuff, a metaphysical stance that is exacerbated by but not coextensive with capitalist society. that it fails to appreciate our dependence on non-human nature and to give non-human nature the respect and recognition that it deserves, that it's still too wedded to industrial society and technology, which may contribute to alienation and environmental destruction, regardless of who owns the means of production, that it holds a productivist and progressivist view of history too closely tied to these, and that it privileges the often white working class, sometimes to the exclusion or detriment of other oppressed groups whose interests may in fact be opposed. And you can, so this is just one cheap example, was the big unions endorsing the pipelines, right, for just like a handful of jobs. Now, in defense of Marx himself, I think the case is really shakier than many people assume. I think his early work does tend to display a Eurocentric conception of historical progress, but Kevin Anderson, in particular in Marx at the Margins, and others have also showed how Marx's views have changed over his lifetime substantially for the better. And the ubiquitous charges of uncritical productivism and indifference or hostility towards environmental concerns have also been upended by works like, for example, John Bellamy Foster's Marxist Ecology, which highlights the deep and surprisingly prescient ecological foundation of Marxist philosophy. And a lot of critics who are otherwise, I think, generally pretty good, don't always acknowledge these complexities. So, for example, in a recent editorial in The Guardian, Julian Brave Noisecat argues that, quote, Marx, Lenin, and Mao no longer offer a scythe sharp enough to fell the stalks of capitalism, end quote, because unlike indigenous people, he argues, they still treat the land and its non-human inhabitants as property. Yet Marx himself argued that from the standpoint of communism, quote, the private property of particular individuals in the earth will appear just as absurd as the private property of one man and other men. Even an entire society, a nation, or all simultaneously existing societies taken together are not owners of the earth. They are simply its possessors, its beneficiaries, and have to bequeath it in an improved state to succeeding generations. In other places, like Marx talks about how he cites Thomas Munzer saying that it's intolerable that all creatures have been turned into property, the fishes of the water, the birds of the air, the plants on the earth, the creatures too must become free. So these sorts of things, I think, do not strike me as intrinsically incompatible with the positive argument that Noisecat is making. So I just want to put that out there for the Marxists who might be feeling defensive right now. But I also want to say that nonetheless, in light of our ecological situation today and the ways in which it is entwined with the long and appalling history of colonial oppressions, I think that there are legitimate questions to be asked about Marx's views, particularly on the importance of a high level of material wealth for the possibility of communism, the distinctively human and thus inherently positive character of the progressive development of new needs and capacities, and the strong anthropocentrism sometimes indicated by this brand of humanism. This matters because these commitments, I think, are still taken as central planks of many visions of socialism today, and not only by accelerationists arguing for fully automated luxury communism, right?
The Jetsons.
Yeah, it's the dream. I also just want to say this is a little quote from Glenn Coldhard's book, which I recommend. And I think this is a really important point that he makes, where she says, by ignoring or downplaying the injustice of colonial dispossession, critical theory and left political strategy not only risk becoming complicit in the very structures and processes of domination that it ought to oppose, but it risks overlooking what could prove to be invaluable glimpses into the ethical practices and preconditions required for the construction of a more just and sustainable world order. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit with the time that I have left. Given the scale and character of the ecological crisis we face, I think the socialized, rationalized, and democratized regulation of our metabolism with the rest of nature is indeed desperately needed. At the same time, certain aspects of Marx's vision may be troubling for us today. It would be difficult, I think, to tell someone like Peter Fraser, who rejects crude accelerationism, that he's simply being a bad Marxist when he argues that, quote, hopefully one day we'll live in a future of limitless energy and automated production, and so the many aspects of our governments that are dedicated to either protecting or redistributing wealth will be unnecessary. But there will still be big questions that arise. Do we try to salvage Earth, or do we go to Mars, right? And I want to say the problem here is not simply his reading of Marx, which seems to me to be plausible, if a little bit narrow. It's instead that such modernist imaginaries are no longer credible, if they ever really were, and that Fraser's we does not seem to include those whose relationship to the Earth and its inhabitants is more than merely instrumental. Indeed, such visions of the future, I think, are implicitly premised upon the complete destruction of those worlds. So we can agree with the Marxists that we cannot realistically oppose imperialism and environmental destruction without opposing capitalism, while still recognizing that anti-capitalism alone is not a sufficient condition for human and ecological flourishing, and that certain aspects of modern societies to which we have been enculturated may have to be re-examined. As Winona, how am I doing on time?
You have exactly 5 minutes.
Oh, cool. Okay. As Winona LaDuke concisely put it in a recent talk at NYU, quote, "A society that consumes 1/3 of the world's resources," that's the US, "is unsustainable. This level of consumption requires constant intervention into other people's lands. That's what's going on." It's a very nice, concise, but I think true statement. And Marxists rightly point out that as a system of ceaselessly expanding production, capitalism requires and actively cultivates this kind of consumption, which cannot be combated through ethical consumerism. But many of them, at the same time, want to retain our high levels of consumption, albeit with various shades of green window dressing, right? So you just hear all the time, like, like nothing is too good for the working class, and so on. And this is a nice sentiment, right? But it needs to be put in the context of a world where our stuff comes from somewhere, right? My contention is that ending imperialism, which necessarily involves beginning to make reparations and aggressively attacking entrenched inequalities, will entail more than socializing production, switching to electric cars, and installing solar panels. We can cut down on business flights by simply eliminating the businesses, right? No one needs to fly for an advertising meeting or a merger deal if we've liquidated their firms and perhaps liquefied their CEOs. But
Remain solid.
I don't know. I mean, you could probably use them for fertilizer or something. But this is, I want to say, still not enough. If we're serious about solidarity, nearly every aspect of our lives, frequent meat consumption, frivolous air travel, constant upgrades to our electronics, will ultimately have to be rethought. And I think a lot of Marxists are resistant to this idea. You know, a lot of my friends in the ISO, for example, like, love to make fun of like animal people, right? So they like to post like selfies of themselves with their big steaks and whatever. I think that this happens in a way where nobody's willing to actually like point out what's involved in the production of that stuff. So to illustrate this, let's just briefly return to the Bolivian example and pretend that we're heading towards the robot communist utopia, right? What would we consider fair compensation to indigenous Bolivians for the extraction of the lithium to power our self-driving Teslas that many of the people there may not even want or need, particularly given as we've seen, the deleterious effects of mining with respect to the water supply and so forth, right? I think that there's a problem even in the question itself there, right? And we sometimes tend to assume with the capitalists that everything has its price, but this assumption of fungibility is not always shared. So this was a story from a little while ago about the Boscov-Ellen First Nation in Canada who rejected $1.15 billion to have a liquefied natural gas pipeline built through their territory. And when they were asked why they would reject so much money, they basically just said, you're asking the wrong question, right? And we might imagine, that some people down here would say a similar sort of thing. But even setting these sorts of objections aside, the question is really why should they have to trade anything else away, given the history that I just very briefly scratched the surface of here, right? And okay, I'm going to skip through this stuff because we don't really have a lot of time. I'm basically just trying to convince you that it's going to take a lot to get down to 2 degrees Celsius, which is still not enough to avoid a lot of the ice melting. Basically, you have to fly less, you have to eat less meat, blah, 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 blah. And I also just wanted to briefly point out that it's not just climate change, right? You may have seen this, the Earth Overshoot Day thing, where if the whole world lived like the United States does, it would take about 4.3 Earth's worth of stuff to sustain that level of consumption. Okay, so I'm going to conclude. Like liberals, I think Northern Marxists sometimes tend to excuse our unsustainable lifestyles by pretending that they will soon be extended to all of the world's inhabitants, and to decry any challenge to this view as Malthusianism. But the inconvenient truth is that our convenience overall else way of life is simply not generalizable, no matter how much technical hand-waving we engage in, and that even if it was, this generalization would almost certainly mean the complete foreclosure of alternative ways of life. Given this fact and that the achievement of our current lifestyle was only possible through the constant oppression, enslavement, and murder of other peoples and the pillaging of the planet, its continued existence appears to be indefensible. If I had a little bit more time, I'd talk about why this doesn't entail going back to the Stone Age, right? It doesn't entail giving up on universalism. It actually entails just being consistent in our universalism. So I would respond to some of the sort of like common objections that you hear to this sort of stuff. The basic point that I want to get across is that there are legitimate discussions to be had about what sorts of technologies are necessary and appropriate, but that those conversations need to be had with in a historically conscious, less anthropocentric and less Eurocentric way. I think this sort of radical democratic, historically conscious decision-making about what we need and how to make it without needlessly harming others is impossible under capitalism and would be extremely difficult to realize under socialism. But unless we take it seriously, we're going to continue to be a part of the problem rather than a part of the solution. Thanks, guys.